Hey guys, we're on Unit 6. This is day 7. We're going to talk about all the properties we've learned so far about our shapes. All right, so we're going to fill this little table out, and we'll write yes if the quad has the property and no if it does not. Okay. All right, so here we go. First property, that should say at least one pair of opposite sides parallel. And we know the trapezoid has that, so we'll go ahed and print yes. Isosceles trapezoids will also have at least one pair of parallel, as well as all of our parallelograms, including the rectangle, the rhombus, and the square, all have to have at least one pair of parallel. Okay. Two pairs of opposite sides parallel, that begins with the parallelogram. And since the rectangle, rhombus, and square are all parallelograms, we'll say yes for all of them. Okay. Next property says two pair of opposite sides congruent. And that starts with a parallelogram as well. It all has two pairs of opposite sides equal. Okay? And a rectangle will also have its opposite sides equal. A rhombus will have two pairs of opposite sides equal. And so will a square. Now, a rhombus and a square both have all sides equal, okay, but that's still two pairs of opposite sides equal. Okay. Our next property says two pairs of opposite angles congruent, and that is also a parallelogram, a rectangle, a rhombus, and a square. Will all have two pairs of opposite angles equal. Okay. Congruent diagonals. All right, so an isosceles trapezoid turns into an isosceles trapezoid from a trapezoid by having congruent diagonals. Parallelograms leans, so their diagonals not equal. Rectangle stands nice straight up, so diagonals will be equal. Rhombus goes back to slanting, so no equal diagonals. And a square has equal diagonals. Okay. All right, diagonals bisect each other. That happens in a parallelogram, and therefore it will happen in all the parallelograms, including the rectangle, the rhombus, and the square, where the diagonals cut each other in half, where that point where they intersect is the midpoint of each diagonal. Then we get to perpendicular diagonals, and that did not happen until the rhombus. And since a square is a rhombus, it will happen in it too. Okay. Has all right angles. Okay? And when they say right angles, they're talking about in the corners, like where a rectangle has them, and a square will have them. Okay. Consecutive sides congruent. And when you make consecutive sides equal, they become equal. So our shapes that have all equal sides will be the rhombus and the square. And last property, diagonals bisect the angles. That didn't happen to the rhombus. And since every square is a rhombus, it'll also happen in it. All right. So notice our square here is the granddaddy of all properties. He has all yeses. Okay. Rhombus comes in a close second with only two of the properties missing. Okay. Rectangle comes in a close third. He has three of the properties missing. Parallelogram has a bunch of properties, but not as many as the square does. Okay? And notice the trapezoid and the isosceles trapezoid don't have very many properties at all. All right, so now we're going to go down and we'll answer some questions, some multiple choice questions about the properties. Okay? So number 1 says, which statement about quadrilaterals is true? All quadrilaterals have 4 right angles. No, that's not true. Okay? A trapezoid is a quadrilateral, and then it doesn't have 4 right angles. All quads have equal sides. Trapezoids are quadrilaterals, and they don't have 4 equal sides. All quadrilaterals have 4 sides. Yes, that's the definition of a quad, a shape with 4 sides. Okay. Number 2, a parallelogram must be a rectangle when. And for these questions, I really like to draw them. So I like to draw a parallelogram. And then I draw a rectangle. And I think about what the difference is. Okay. And they are talking about the diagonals. Okay, at first, diagonals are perpendicular. It doesn't happen in either shape. Diagonals being equal. Now that is the difference. Okay. In this shape, diagonals are not congruent. And here the diagonals are congruent. Okay. So in this one, this diagonal is longer than this one. But in a rectangle, the diagonals are equal. Okay, so I'm going to hold on to that one. Opposite sides are parallel. That happens in both of them. Opposite sides are congruent also happens in both of them. So this is the one property that doesn't happen in a parallelogram, but it has to happen in a rectangle, so that's our property. Number 3, a parallelogram is always a rectangle. So I can keep my same picture from up above. I don't have to redraw it unless you need to see it again. Okay. But it says a parallelogram is always a rectangle if the diagonals are congruent. And that we just talked about is the property that changes from a parallelogram to a rectangle. So we're going to hold on to that one. The diagonals bisect each other happens in both. The diagonals intersect at right angles doesn't happen in either one. And the opposite angles are congruent happens in both of them. So it's got to be number 1 is the property that's different. Okay. Next one. A parallelogram must be a rhombus. So we'll draw a parallelogram. And we'll draw a rhombus. Okay. And they're asking about the diagonals again. So again, the parallelogram, they're not equal, but neither are they in a rhombus. Both shapes slant. Okay. In a rhombus, right here are 4 right angles and not in a parallelogram. And also in a rhombus, the diagonals bisect the angles where they don't in a parallelogram. So we're going to be looking for a property that the parallelogram doesn't have, but that the rhombus does have. Okay? So a parallelogram must be a rhombus if its diagonals are congruent. Nope, they're not congruent in either one. Bisect each other. Diagonals bisect each other in both of them, so that's not it. A parallelogram must be a rhombus if the diagonals do not bisect its angles, but they do bisect the angles in the rhombus, so that's not it. Are perpendicular to each other. That is the property that the parallelogram doesn't have, but that the rhombus does have. And so we'll take that one. Okay. All right. I'll see you guys on the back side of notes for some more questions.